near and dear to us tonight because we all know people that have gone through this, and our hearts go out to them. And I want us to put ourselves in their shoes and understand that we can go through the same thing, and that is falling away. That is messing up, falling flat on our face, making a mistake, committing a sin, and even leaving the Lord completely. And when somebody does that, and we know, each and every one of us know people here at Tanner that are near and dear to us that have done that, and we can picture them in our mind, maybe many years ago, maybe recently. And sometimes, no matter who it is, we always hate that, and hopefully we're reaching out to them, trying to get them back, trying to encourage them and bring them back to the Lord. But sometimes you kind of see it coming, if you know what I'm saying. In other words, sometimes that person is not very strong, and so you can kind of see that coming. Maybe they weren't here very often, so you think, well, okay, they weren't here often, they never come to worship, they're not very plugged in, they're not very committed, they don't seem to have their priorities right, and so it's no wonder that they're not here anymore. And I think we all know people like that, unfortunately. However, that's not what I want to talk about tonight. I want to talk about the people that you never saw it coming. If you've looked at your bulletin today, you see the title of the lesson tonight is Even the Strong Can Fall. I want us to think about ourselves more than anybody else, okay? Let's think about ourselves. But who I'm talking to tonight, the Sunday night crowd, is usually the stronger bunch. Not always the case, but oftentimes it's the ones that you're here, you're plugged in, you're active, you're more dedicated than most. But I want us to understand that we can fall away too. And the guy that we're going to look at tonight was a very, very strong man. He's one of those that, we would say, wow, I never saw that coming. Sometimes when somebody like that falls away and we think, man, they were here every time the doors were open, they were plugged in, they had a lot of Bible knowledge maybe a leader in the Lord's church, maybe an elder, maybe a minister. We've all known people like that, and it just floors us, and we think, what in the world happened, What were they thinking? What happened in their life that brought them to that point? And so tonight what we're looking at is a guy that he's very, very strong. In fact, I would say, of course, he's an apostle, but he was probably one of the strongest out of all the apostles. He was, I would like to think, even a leader in the apostles. He's the one that stood out more than about all the others, and that is Peter. So let's look at Peter. We've got a lot to read tonight. John chapter 18. We're going to begin with verse 15. John 18, beginning with verse 15. And Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. Now that disciple was known to the high priest and went with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest. But Peter stood at the door outside. Then the other disciple who was known to the high priest went out and spoke to her who kept the door and brought Peter in. Then the servant girl who kept the door said to Peter, "You are not also one of this man's disciples, are you?" And he said, "I am not." Now the servants and officers who had made a fire of coals stood there, for it was cold, and they warmed themselves. And Peter stood with them and warmed himself. Now skip down to verse 25. 25, now Simon Peter stood and warmed himself. Therefore they said to him, "You are not also one of his disciples, are you?" And he denied it and said, "I am not." And one of the servants of the high priest, a relative of him whose ear Peter cut off, said, "Did I not see you in the garden with him?" And Peter then denied again, and immediately a rooster crowed. So, we all know this account, right? What I want us to do tonight is I want us to look at ourselves. And I want us to look at Peter. We're going to go back and we're going to read a lot of different passages, but what caused this very, very strong man to fall away from the Lord? What caused him, out of all the apostles, to deny the Lord the way that he did? And the intent tonight is this, to make application. That's always the intent. We want Bible knowledge, yes, but we want to apply it to our life so that we can learn and do better and be closer to the Lord, right? And so maybe if we can see some signs, if you will, of Peter, what he did that led to his downfall, maybe we could see those signs in our own life and prevent us from falling away. So the very first sign I want us to look at tonight is the sign of self-confidence. 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 And I would say excessive self-confidence. I'm talking about pride. I'm talking about arrogance. Now, sometimes I think that we don't have enough confidence in ourselves, in the abilities and things that God has given us. You know, the scriptures talk about having a spirit of, not having a spirit of fear, but power, love, and of a sound mind. And so we need to be confident in the fact that we belong to God and the abilities that He gives us. But when that goes too far to the point to where we start putting too much confidence in self and more in us than in God, then it becomes arrogance and pride, and that, of course, also leads to a fall. And so the question is, what led Peter to this kind of attitude, to this state of arrogance and pride? Go back to John chapter 13. Let's look. John chapter 13, this is when Jesus is, of course, telling His disciples that He's about to go away and that they can't follow Him. In John chapter 13, and notice what Peter says, beginning with verse 36. Simon Peter said to Him, Lord, where are you going? And Jesus answered him, where I'm going, you cannot follow me now, but you shall follow me afterward. And Peter said to Him, Lord, why can I not follow you now? I will lay down my life for your sake. And Jesus answered him, will you lay down your life for my sake? Most assuredly I say to you, the rooster shall not crow till you have denied me 3 times. So what is Jesus doing here? Some people have said that He's just prophesying here. Well, He's definitely prophesying, because prophesying means, to tell something that has not happened yet. He's definitely doing that, but He's also, I think, rebuking Peter here more so than prophesying. So yes, He's prophesying, but He's rebuking Peter, I think, for being overconfident, because he knew how Peter was. I mean, Peter's the one that, all throughout the Scriptures we see him put his foot in his mouth time and time again, right? Over and over again we see that. I don't know if y'all have seen The Chosen. Some of you have. And I know I've said something about it before, and I always have to say this. They may take some liberties, okay? But I think it's a very, very good series. I think Netflix puts that out. But anyway, they depict Simon as being kind of full of himself, kind of arrogant. He's the one, and he's a little bit muscular, and everything. And he's the one that's, not gun shy at all, and just very outspoken. And I think there's a reason for that, because that's really what we read in the Bible concerning Peter. I think that's how he was. So think of three or four different incidents. For instance, one of them is the disciples out on a boat on the Sea of Galilee. Y'all remember this? The storm comes up and everything. And so Jesus all night has been praying to the Father. He's been away from them. And so He begins to walk on the water out to the boat to comfort them, to calm them down. They see Him and think it's a ghost, which sounds silly, but they've never seen anybody walk on the water. And Jesus had never done that in front of them before anyway. And so they see that. They're scared to death. And then, of course, Jesus tries to calm them. But Peter says, if it's you, Lord, command me to walk to you. And so he does. He steps out of the boat. Now, part of us wants to think that, well, that means he has a lot of faith, probably more so than the rest of the disciples because of what he did. Well, is it that? If you remember, Jesus does not say anything in a positive way about him having faith. In fact, on the contrary, he says when he begins to sink and he grabs him by the hand and pulls him up, he says, why did you doubt? Why were you fearful, O you of what? Little faith. And so the question is, why in the world did Peter do that? Well, I think it's because he's maybe a little bit arrogant. I think it's maybe because he's a little bit full of himself. That's my opinion. But you kind of see that throughout the gospel accounts. Another occasion is where Jesus is saying, I'm going to go into Jerusalem, and I'm eventually going to be put to death there in Jerusalem. And of course, the disciples are all taken back by this and don't hardly know what to say, but you have Peter who says, not so, Lord, it will never be. And basically he's saying, not on my watch, this will never happen. And you remember Jesus says, get behind me, Satan. You remember that? So he's just full of himself. He's a little bit arrogant. Another time, of course, he cuts off the ear there in the Garden of Gethsemane, and you can say, well, that's courage. Well, is it? I don't know if it was courage or not. You have another time in, Matthew 17 on what we call the Mount of Transfiguration. Y'all remember that? And you have, of course, Elijah and Moses and Jesus there. And it was whom that spoke up and said, hey, let's build an altar and sacrifice and worship to all of them. That was Peter, right? And he had to be rebuked for that. And so you see this over and over again. So it's not hard to tell that Peter, out of all the 12 apostles, was the one that was full of himself and prideful and arrogant and had a little bit more self-confidence than maybe he should have. And so we've got to ask ourselves, where does our strength come from? Especially, for a lack of better terms, the Sunday night crowd, you know. The ones that normally are and you are to be commended, you know, because you are the ones for the most part that do most everything, honestly. I mean, you're devoted, you're here, you're involved, you're committed, you usually have a lot of Bible knowledge, you know, and so you come all the time and you're to be commended for that. What I'm trying to get us to see is if we let that go to our head, then it could be our downfall. When we get too confident in self. And so ask yourself, where does my strength come from? If you're going through a difficult time, I should say when you're going through a difficult time, because we all will be. When you're going through a difficult time, do you think, well, I can get through this, you know, I can stand on my own 2 feet, I can do this? Or are we thinking, God can help me with this? God, please, I need your help with this. I'm struggling. Where does your strength come from? So we need to be very careful not to be arrogant, not to be too full of self. Just because I've been a Christian for X amount of years and I'm there every time the door's open and I have so much Bible knowledge and man, I'm a strong child of God. Fantastic. Always remember your strength comes from God, not from yourself at all. All right, let's look at a second sign. The second sign of Peter falling away is distancing himself from the Lord. And so look at John chapter 18 and Matthew 26, and we're going to put those two accounts together, John 18 and Matthew 26. So Jesus is going into the courtyard to have his trial, if you want to call it that. You know, we call it a mock trial. But he goes before Annas first, and then before eventually Caiaphas, which is the high priest at that time. And he's going to go through this trial. So he's there, and outside the courtyard is John and Peter. Now, notice, and I got to looking at this past week, and it really stood out to me more than it ever has. You have a huge contrast between these two men. And it's so odd because John's the one that you think about being more tender-hearted and maybe just a little bit more timid. And Peter is the one that is outspoken and full of self and all of that. But you kind of see the role switch just a little bit here, in my opinion. In John chapter 18, look at verse 16. John 18:16. But Peter stood at the door outside, and this is the courtyard. Then the other disciple, and that is John, of course, who was known to the high priest, went out and spoke to her who kept the door and brought Peter in. And so it was John that went up to the door, you know. John was not the one that was fearful and reserved and back behind and making sure everything was going to be okay. John was the one that went to the door to go ahead and for them to be able to come in. Peter was the one that was more reserved. Now put that together with Matthew's account, Matthew 26 and verse 58. Matthew 26:58. And it says, but Peter followed him at a distance to the high priest's courtyard, and he went in and sat with the servants to see the end. So do you see what's going on there? I mean, it seems to me like John is the one that is very concerned about Jesus and wants to follow Jesus as closely as he possibly can and doesn't mind a bit being associated with Jesus, where Peter is the one that is following at a distance, who is waiting on John for the okay for us to come in, and who follows Jesus at a distance and does not want to be associated. No, I was not one of his disciples. You see? Arrogance all the time, if you allow it to continue in your life, will lead to a fall. Because you start distancing yourself from the Lord because you start putting too much stock in self and not enough in Him. And I believe that's what we see with Peter here. And so let me ask you a personal question for us to make application tonight. Was there ever a time in your life where you were more faithful to God than you are right now? Was there ever a time in your life that you felt closer to God than right now? Was there ever a time in your life to where you were more involved in His kingdom than you are right now? And if so, then you've got to ask yourself, why is that the case? Because He hasn't moved away from you, right? And so I want to encourage you to recognize that. And whatever it takes to come back closer to Him, if that means more Bible study, if that means more prayer, to strengthen your prayer life, if that means coming more and worshiping Him, if that means being involved in the brothers and sisters and in their lives and helping people out, if that means maybe standing up for what is right when maybe you haven't been as much lately, if that means being a better co-worker, if that means whatever that means to get closer to the Lord and to correct that. And so the second thing that we see that Peter, that led to his downfall, is distance. Here's the third and last thing, and that is the third sign is loving the world. And I don't know, and I put loving the world, it might be more comfortable with the world. That might be the best way to put that. And so going to John 18 again, let's look at that. We see Peter doing this, I believe here. Perhaps Peter began to connect with those around that fire, when he distanced himself from the Lord. Do you see application there? When he distances himself from the Lord, he finds himself warming himself with the enemy, right? And so that's what happens oftentimes when we distance ourselves. So John chapter 18:25. Now Simon Peter stood and warmed himself. Therefore they said to him, "You are not also one of the disciples, are you?" And he denied it and said, "I am not." And one of the servants of the high priest, a relative of him whose ear Peter cut off, said, Did I not see you in the garden with him? And Peter then denied it again, and immediately a rooster crowed. Anytime I think that we put more confidence in self than we should, it turns to arrogance and pride. When we do that, we tend to rely on self a little bit too much, and when we do that, we automatically distance ourselves just a little bit away from God because we're relying on self just a little bit too much, and before you know it, you feel a little bit more comfortable with the world. Because when you distance yourself from God, that's the outcome, is that you're closer to the world. And so we can see that with Peter. Can we see that with ourselves? So the guy that we looked at tonight, he is the strongest of the strong. We're not looking at somebody that is like, oh, well, I could have seen that coming. No, you're talking about Simon Peter, And so tonight, as we make application, I'm not asking you if you're a strong person or if you're a weak person. I'm asking, where are you at right now in your life? It could have been, very, very strong once upon a time, but right now you're struggling. It may have been that you're struggling, but right now you're growing closer to the Lord. Where are you at in your faith right now at this point in your life? And if you've ever been closer to the Lord in your life than you are now, then I want to encourage you to make that necessary change and come back to Him. One of the things I absolutely love about our Lord that you see with Peter is He is a God of second chances. Amen? I love that, And so Simon Peter, he falls flat on his face. He denies the Lord, and he acts like he doesn't even know Him and follows at a distance and just makes all kinds of mistakes. But what did Peter do not too long after that? He stands there on the day of Pentecost in front of thousands with the keys of the kingdom and preaches about salvation in Jesus Christ. He gave them a second chance. God will always give you a second chance. But here's the thing, you've got to recognize that it's Him that you need, and you've got to make the necessary change in your life. Can we help you with that this evening in any kind of way? Let us know while we stand and sing this song for our encouragement.